There is a man weeping in the middle of a celebration. Everyone around him is cheering. They are waving branches, throwing their coats down in the dust at his feet, shouting for joy on what looks like the best day of his life. And he is sobbing, out loud, in public, not tearing up. The word the eyewitness uses is the word you would use for someone standing over a coffin. Nobody in that crowd understands why. By the end of this, you will. But to see it, you have to stand where he is standing. So picture the hill. A man stops on the shoulder of it, at the top of a road he has walked toward his whole life. Below him a city spreads out in the afternoon light, white stone and gold, terraces climbing toward a temple, so bright you have to look away from it. It is the most beautiful city in his world, and all around him, people are celebrating. They have torn branches from the trees. They are throwing their coats into the road in front of him. They are shouting a word that means save us now, shouting it with joy because they think the saving has finally come. And in the middle of all that noise, the man they are cheering for looks down at the city, and he breaks. We are going to come back to that man and that city and those tears, but not yet, because first I want you to notice something about the picture of Jesus you carry in your head. Most of us, even those of us who have gone to church our whole lives, have quietly built a statue. A Jesus who is always calm, always faintly smiling, never rattled, never loud, never afraid. A face on a stained glass window. Serene, untouchable, above it all. Here's the problem. That man is not the man in the Gospels. The Jesus in the actual pages doesn't glide through his life 3 feet off the ground. He gets angry enough to knock over furniture. He groans out loud from somewhere deep in his gut. He throws his head back and shouts with joy. He weeps in front of crowds. And on his last night, he is so afraid that his body does something doctors have a name for, something that should not be physically possible. This is not a story about a distant God. This is not a story about a statue made of stone. This is not a story about a man who felt nothing. This is a story about every time the God of the universe broke down, cried, raged, trembled, and rejoiced, exactly the way you do. And by the end, you are going to understand something that changes everything. There is no feeling you have ever had that he has not already stood inside. So let's start where nobody expects God to start. Not with tears, with a whip. To understand the whip, you have to understand where he was standing. The temple in Jerusalem was not a small building. According to the historian Josephus, who saw it with his own eyes before the Romans tore it down, the whole complex was enormous. A platform of polished stone, so large it could hold a crowd you would count in the tens of thousands. And the outermost court, the one closest to the street, had a name. The Court of the Gentiles. It was the one place in the entire temple where an outsider, a foreigner, a seeker, someone not born into Israel, was allowed to come and pray to the God of the whole earth. That is the court they had turned into a marketplace. Picture it with me. You walk in hoping to find God, and instead you walk into a livestock market. Cattle bellowing, sheep pressed into pens, doves in stacked cages, beating their wings against the bars. The floor slick with the mess animals make. And everywhere, the tables, the money changers, sitting behind their scales. Here's the part most people miss. Those tables were a trap for the poor. If you came from far away, you couldn't drag a sacrifice across the country, so you bought one here, at whatever inflated price they decided. And you couldn't pay with ordinary Roman coins, because those had the emperor's face on them, so you had to change your money first, at whatever cut they decided to take. A poor man, come to make things right, with God, got squeezed at the door. And it all happened in the one square of ground reserved for the people furthest from the inside. And Jesus walks into that. He doesn't say anything at first. John tells us he sits down and makes a whip out of cords, braids it, strand by strand, with his own hands. Sit with that image for a second, because it undoes the statue completely. This is not a flash of temper. This is not a man who lost control. A man who loses control doesn't stop to braid a whip. This is deliberate. This is a slow, rising heat that he chooses to act on. Then he stands up, and he drives them out. All of them. He flips the tables, coins scattering, and ringing across the stone, spinning into the cracks. He opens the pens. He shouts over the chaos, and the words he shouts are these: "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples, watching this, remember an old line from the Psalms and suddenly understand it. "Zeal for your house will consume me." Consume. Burn him up from the inside. This is the first thing I want you to see about the emotions of Jesus. His anger was not random, and it was not for himself. Nobody ever recorded Jesus losing his temper because someone insulted him, cheated him, or hurt his pride. Not once. The one thing that made him pick up a whip was watching the powerful get rich off people who had come looking for God. His anger had a direction. It always aimed the same way, down at the one stepping on the weak. And that should do something to you, because the God you may have been quietly afraid of, the one you assume is annoyed with you, tapping his foot, waiting for you to slip, that is not the God swinging this whip. This anger isn't pointed at the struggling. It's pointed at the ones who make life harder for the struggling. If you have ever walked into a religious room and felt fleeced instead of found, felt like a transaction instead of a son or a daughter, then understand something. Jesus felt the same way about it. He walked into it, and he flipped it over. But here's what's strange. The same man who could clear a courtyard with a whip is about to pull one deaf stranger aside, away from every crowd, and do something so tender, so personal, it almost doesn't fit in the same story. Stay with me. Before we go on, look at what we've already seen. The statue is gone, isn't it? The calm, faintly smiling figure who never raised his voice, that was never him. We just watched him braid a whip and clear a courtyard because the poor were being robbed at the door of God. But stay with me, because in a few minutes you are going to see the one emotion almost nobody expects to find in Jesus. The feeling that, more than the rage and more than the tears, most people have never once pictured on his face. It changes how you read everything after it. So do two quick things before we get there. Leave one comment and tell me which emotion of Jesus has surprised you most. So far, I read them. And tap subscribe so the rest of this doesn't slip out of your feed before you reach that moment. Because the next thing he does turns everything on its head. This time he isn't angry. This time, of all things, he's about to throw his head back and laugh with joy. Leave the noise of the temple behind and travel north, out past the edge of Jewish country, into a region called the Decapolis, 10 Greek cities, foreign ground, the kind of place a respectable teacher was not supposed to spend his time. And here a crowd brings Jesus, a man who cannot hear a single sound in the world and can barely speak. Think about what that life was in the ancient world. No sign language, no writing he was ever taught, just silence and a tongue that won't obey him, and a crowd that talks about him over his head as if he isn't standing right there. He has spent his whole life on the outside of every conversation. And watch what Jesus does. He doesn't heal him from a distance with a word the way he easily could. Mark tells us he took him aside from the crowd privately. He got him alone, away from the staring eyes, away from the people treating him like a problem to be solved. And then, with no words the man could hear, Jesus spoke the only language the man had left. He touched him. He put his fingers in the man's ears. He touched the man's tongue. He looked him in the eyes so the man would know exactly who was about to help him and exactly what was about to happen. And then, before he heals him, Jesus does something the gospel writer could have left out and didn't. He looks up to heaven and he groans. The Greek word is estanazo. It's not a sigh of impatience. It's a deep, involuntary groan, the sound that comes up out of your chest when you are carrying something too heavy to say. Standing in front of one broken body, in one forgotten man, on the far edge of nowhere, Jesus feels the full weight of everything that is wrong with the world, every ear that cannot hear, every tongue that cannot speak, every person shoved to the outside, and it pulls a groan up out of him before he fixes it. Here's what I want you to see. He is God. He is 1 second away from making this man whole with a single word. And still, he feels it. He doesn't heal at arm's length, untouched. He aches first, and then he heals. And then he says one word, in the man's own dialect. A word so simple, it's almost a whisper. Ephatha. Be opened. And the silence of a lifetime breaks. Sound rushes in. The man speaks. Now hold that tenderness in your mind, because the next thing I'm going to show you is the flip side of the very same heart. Here is what a heart like that does. A heart that burns at injustice and aches over a stranger doesn't just carry the heavy things. It also feels the good ones just as hard. So it should not surprise you that the same man who groaned in the Decapolis is the man we are about to watch do the opposite, all the way at the other end of what a person can feel. We have watched him rage. We have watched him groan. But there is one moment in the Gospels where the writer reaches for a word he almost never uses about Jesus, a word for pure, physical, overflowing joy. The disciples had just come back from a mission trip, buzzing, talking over each other about everything that had happened. And Luke says that in that hour Jesus rejoiced in the Spirit. But the English is far too polite. The word underneath is egalio. It doesn't mean he smiled quietly. It means to leap, to spring, to be so full of gladness your body can't contain it. It's the word for a child jumping up and down. It's the word for what the unborn John the Baptist does in his mother's womb when Mary walks in. This is Jesus, with his head back and his whole face lit up, gladness pouring out of him faster than he can hold it. And what set it off is worth everything. He wasn't rejoicing over a crowd or a miracle or a victory anyone could see. He was rejoicing that his Father had opened up the deepest things of heaven, not to the powerful, not to the polished, not to the experts, but to ordinary people. To fishermen, to nobodies, to the exact kind of people the money changers had been fleecing at the temple door. That is what makes God leap for joy, not the impressive, the overlooked, finally let in. So look at the range of him now. The same heart that burned white-hot at injustice, that groaned over one deaf man's broken body, throws itself into open, leaping joy over ordinary people coming home to God. No stone figure feels that much. No man dialed down to one flat, holy expression laughs like that. This is the most fully alive human being who ever walked the earth, feeling all of it, all the way down, exactly the way you were built to, and mostly are too guarded to. But there is a reason I saved his tears and his terror for last, because the range you've just seen, the rage, the groan, the leaping joy, all of it is about to be tested in the one place none of us can avoid forever. The place where you find out what a heart is really made of. Now watch what happens next. Now I can tell you who the weeping man was. Remember the opening. A man stops on a hillside above the most beautiful city in his world, on the best day anyone thought he would ever have, with crowds cheering and branches waving, and he sobs out loud. That man was Jesus. The hill is the Mount of Olives. The city is Jerusalem. And the day is the one we now call Palm Sunday, the day they welcomed him like a king. Luke tells us that as he came near and saw the city, he wept over it. And the word is that same raw, out-loud grief, not a tear sliding down a serene face, but a man weeping in front of a crowd on the day they were throwing him a parade. Why? Because he could see what they couldn't. He could see the wall around, that city broken open, the stones thrown down, the children inside it, a destruction he knew was coming within a generation. And he says the saddest sentence, if you had only known, on this day, the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. Do you see it now? He is being cheered, and he is grieving for the very people cheering him. He weeps not for himself, but for a city that is about to reject him and pay a terrible price for it. That is the shape of his tears. He cries over the people who are about to hurt him. But the hardest moment is still ahead. Because within the week, that same man will be on his knees in a garden at night, and for the first time we will see something we have not seen in any of this. Not anger, not compassion, not joy, fear. The garden is called Gethsemane. He takes 3 of his closest friends, Peter, James, and John, and he says something to them that should stop you cold. My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. The Greek word Matthew uses for his state is adamonio, and it is one of the heaviest words for distress in the entire language. It means to be in anguish, so deep it is close to horror, the feeling of being crushed, of not being able to get a breath. This is the Son of God, and he is terrified. And then Luke, who was a physician, records a detail no one would invent. He says that, as Jesus prayed, in agony, his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Many doctors reading that line have pointed to a rare condition called hematidrosis, in which extreme stress ruptures the tiny blood vessels around the sweat glands, and a person, under the most crushing terror the body can experience, sweats something like blood. The gospel doesn't hand us a diagnosis. It simply tells us his sweat fell like drops of blood. But you don't need a medical chart to feel what that picture is telling you. His body was buckling under the weight of what was coming. And listen to what he prays. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. He asks for a way out. The God of the universe, on his knees in the dark, asks his Father if there is any other road 3 times, while his closest friends fall asleep a stone's throw away and leave him to face it alone. I want you to stop here, because you have been in this garden. Maybe not this one, but you have knelt somewhere, the edge of a hospital bed, the floor of a bathroom at 3 in the morning, a car in a parking lot you couldn't make yourself drive out of, and you have prayed the same prayer. Please, if there is any other way, please take this from me. And it felt like the words went up and hit the ceiling and slid back down. It felt like the sky was made of brass. It felt like no one was there. Hear this. The one time in human history that prayer was most real, most desperate, most sincere, it was prayed by Jesus, in the dark, sweating blood, with heaven silent and his friends asleep. He knows exactly what that feels like. He has knelt on your floor, and then it goes further than even the garden. On the cross, in the last hours, the sky itself goes dark, and out of that darkness Jesus cries out, not in Hebrew, the polished language of the synagogue, but in Aramaic, the language he learned, as a child at Mary's knee, the language you fall back into when you can't hold yourself together anymore. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Sabachthani, forsaken. And here is something worth knowing. That cry is the opening line of Psalm 22, a psalm every Jewish listener at the foot of that cross would have recognized instantly. It begins in what feels like total abandonment, and it ends, many verses later, in rescue and praise. So when Jesus cries those words, he is not filing a report on where the Father has gone. He is reaching for the one song in all of Scripture that starts exactly where he is, in the blackest sense of being forsaken, and he says it out loud, at the top of his lungs, so that no one who has ever felt abandoned by God could say he doesn't understand. And a Roman soldier standing under that cross, a hardened man who had watched dozens of people die, hears that cry and watches how this one dies, and says the last thing you would expect a pagan executioner to say. Truly, this man was the Son of God. He got it. The rage, the groan, the joy, the tears, the terror, the God-forsaken cry in the dark. The soldier saw all of it break out of one dying man, and somehow that was the thing that convinced him. Not power, not a miracle, the fullness of a real human heart breaking in front of him. So what do you do with a Jesus like this? Let me leave you with 3 things. First, the gospel writers did not have to tell you any of this. Think about that. They were introducing the world to someone they believed was God in the flesh. It would have been easier, cleaner, more impressive to give you the statue, the calm, untouchable figure who floats above human feeling. Instead, they told you he braided a whip. They told you he groaned. They told you he leaped for joy, wept in public, sweated blood, and cried out that he felt forsaken. They kept the emotions in on purpose, because a Savior who cannot feel cannot save you. They wanted you to know he was real. Second, there is no room in your heart he has not already stood inside. You have been angry at something unjust, so has he. You have ached over someone you couldn't fix, so has he. You have been surprised by joy, wept over something you saw coming, been so afraid you could barely breathe, felt completely alone with a God who seemed silent. He has been in every one of those rooms, not as a visitor, as someone who lived there, Whatever you are feeling tonight, you are not feeling it somewhere he has never been. And third, this is the one I want you to carry out of here. Go back to that garden floor. The hospital bed, the 3 a.m. bathroom, the parking lot you couldn't drive out of, the prayer that hit the ceiling and slid back down. You thought, in that moment, that you were alone, that God was somewhere far off, untouched, watching from a safe distance. But he wasn't watching from a distance. He had already knelt exactly where you were kneeling, in a garden called Gethsemane, sweating blood, asking for another way, with the sky gone silent and his friends asleep. He didn't just look at your worst moment. He walked into it first, all the way to a cross and a cry in the dark, so that when you get there, you would find his footprints already in the floor. That is the whole point of every tear and every groan and every drop of blood. Not that God understands your pain from far away. That he came down into it. That he broke down so that you would never have to break down alone. Now I want to hear from you. Of all of it, the rage in the temple, the groan over the deaf man, the leaping joy, the tears over the city, the terror in the garden, the forsaken cry on the cross, which moment reached you the most? Which one sounded like your own life? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And the next time you are somewhere dark and the ceiling feels like brass and you are sure no one is there, remember the man on the hillside who wept over the people cheering him. He did not break down because he was weak. He broke down because he loved. And he is still looking at you exactly that way.